In my remarks today, I want to do three things. First of all, to talk a bit about the global context and what makes the EU so special, because there's so much doom and gloom at the moment that we sometimes forget what is at stake when we talk about being left outside of the European Union or a life outside of the European Union. Secondly, I want to talk a bit about why Hungary matters to people outside and to the EU political experiment. And thirdly, start to address the question of the conference. What would life look like outside the European Union for Hungary? Yesterday, I gave a lecture at the Central European University on Europe's political crisis, and István attacked me for being too gloomy and asked me to explain why I once wrote a book saying that Europe would run the 21st century, and if I still believed in Europe. So maybe in order to make up for my excessive gloominess yesterday, I'll start by talking about why I think the European Union is the most exciting political experiment in the last 500 years. And that isn't just because of the reasons that we're often told, because it managed to end war between European countries, because it supported the democratic transition of post-communist countries, because it's become a monument and a protector of very important values in our continent. I think it's most exciting because it's the biggest innovation in the exercise of political power since the creation of the nation state. The European Union has shown how citizens can enjoy living in small states which are close to their citizens, or closer to their citizens, whilst at the same time enjoying the protection and the economies of scale that you get from having a market with 500 million consumers, policies to tackle continent-sized problems, whether it's environment or organised crime. And more importantly, I think the European Union has shown that there's a completely different way of thinking about security from that which we had come used to over the last few hundred years. And rather than relying on a balance of power and non-interference in each other's affairs, the European Union offers a model of security based on deep economic, political, but above all, legal interdependence. The 80,000 pages of the acquis communautaire that every single member state has implemented signal a new state of affairs where law courts have replaced armies as a way of dealing with disputes. And this European model has been a pioneer on the world stage and has been spreading in different ways through the enlargement of the European Union, through the impact on our neighbours, through the creation of global institutions like the World Trade Organization or the Kyoto, post-Kyoto climate negotiations, which enshrine a European way of working. And finally, because every other region in the world over the last 20 years has started to emulate the European Union and develop its own models of regional integration. And what I had argued in my book on why Europe will run the 21st century was not that Europe would be the most powerful economic bloc or even political or military bloc in the 21st century, but that this European way of doing things was uniquely well suited to a world where American hegemony is receding, where there is a global economy, where there are problems which cut across borders, and where we need to find a way of living together, and where the dream of global government enshrined by the United Nations is unlikely ever to become reality. And I think it's precisely because we're entering a world where Europe doesn't feel like it's going to be the centre of the universe that the European Union is important. As well as the talk about the euro crisis, we're greeted with an almost daily account of our vulnerability. The economic rise of the rest that's moving the centre of economic gravity to emerging powers and changing the structure of the global economy, as well as the political values and norms that are on the ascendant. The pivot of the United States to Asia, which means that we in Europe will increasingly have to guarantee our own security. The emergence of what some think tanks have called a G0 world, where the institutions of global governance are deadlocked and incapable of offering leadership. And in this vacuum, where there is no global government, there has been a rise of regionalism in every single part of the world, from Putin's Eurasian Union to Mercosur and the African Union to measures designed to create an East Asian Union in Asia. And the EU, the European Union, has the resources not just to survive, but to help shape this world. It is the largest single market in the world. It's the #1 trading partner of all the BRIC countries. It has the second largest defense spending, more than all the BRIC countries combined. It has seats in every international forum. But yet, there is a danger that its members no longer believe in the European Union and are exiting from it. And that is why people talk about the danger of a multipolar world without a European pole in it. Yesterday at the CEU, I spoke about this crisis within the EU and some of the ways that Europe needs to be reinvented. And I've got a copy of my paper here, which you can all take if you look at. And I do think that we are going through a real existential crisis at the moment. I don't want to underplay that for a second. But I think it's important, even as we grapple with that crisis, to remember why Europe is worth fighting for and why it is so exciting and why countries like Hungary wanted to join it all those years ago. That brings me to the second question, why Hungary matters so much to the rest of Europe. And as I said at the beginning, I think the reason that Hungary has attracted so much attention is that it is the forum where both the past of the European Union and the future are on trial at the moment. At a time when the Euro and so many other European Union projects are under pressure, the project of enlargement still stands out as one of the signature achievements of the European Union. And in the minds of many Western politicians and also European Commission officials, the transformative power that was used to underpin the democratic transition of post-communist countries was part of a political change of historic proportions. In some ways, it was the biggest process of voluntary regime change in human history. And the 80,000 pages of the Acquis communautaire weren't just seen as the basis of a common market, but also the anchors for liberal democracy across our continent and a different kind of political order in our continent. And that's why, in the minds of so many, the EU accession process was almost seen as a kind of political alchemy. And in Hungary today, that whole way of looking at the world is under pressure. And people are starting to openly wonder in Berlin, in Paris, in London, in other countries, whether we could see that whole process going into reverse and of a European Union member actually ceasing to be a liberal democracy. I don't think anyone thinks that Hungary is being undemocratic. They can see that the government was elected with a large majority, that there is lots of support. But the centralization of power, the attacks on a lot of the institutions have led to a real questioning of the durability of the EU influence on countries which have joined it, which is creating a big debate amongst Europeans. But the other reason I think why Hungary is so important to Europe is it's also the place where the future of EU politics is at stake, because though some of the features of your politics over the last 5 years are unique to post-communist countries, many of the things which seem to be motivating Hungarians and structuring your political discourse are becoming increasingly universal as the Euro crisis works its way through our continent. The history of the EU has long been a dialectical relationship between technocracy and populism. And Hungary, in a way, has been a crucible for both of these trends well before the Euro crisis erupted. And I think the challenge to the EU of the future will be whether democracy can survive in conditions where countries are compelled to introduce austerity, where they're subject to sanctions, where democracy allows people to vote in elections but deprives them of real choices, where there is a neoliberal straitjacket which people find impossible to escape from. And it's also a test of whether domestic politics can actually be organised to defend liberal institutions as you shift from technocracy to populism and people revolt against the stagnation and the inability to reform which has held the country back. And this whole delicate interplay of civil society calling on Brussels institutions to overturn and to constrain what an elected government is doing, I think is a real test for our notions of what democracy is in the 21st century. I think the next few weeks are both going to be critical to see how the European Commission and the member states deal with this process. Over the next few weeks, we're going to see what happens with the cohesion funds, what happens with the anti-infringement procedures. But the bigger question is not what happens in Brussels and what happens in Berlin and Paris, but how your indigenous political processes develop and how Hungarian society responds to these bigger trends. And I think that is, in some ways, going to be the future of politics in many countries, a sort of semi-sovereign nation where political processes at home are interacting with those at a European level. There's going to be lots of talk about that in the next few sessions, and I'm not an expert on Hungarian politics. So I'm just going to end with the third question, which is really what life outside the European Union, if that's what happened, might be like for Hungary. I think it's unlikely that Hungary is going to be forced to leave the European Union, but I do think that it could increasingly find itself on the outside of the EU, not just outside of the charmed circles of political leaders who get on well, who caucus with each other, but actually on the receiving end of an increasing number of policy decisions rather than in a position to shape them. And whilst the current crisis which your country finds itself in is, I think, completely unprecedented, there are examples of other countries that have been marginalised and have experienced isolation. Just within my political and professional life, I've seen John Major and the British government completely isolated in the political processes during the so-called period of beef wars, when the British government refused to cooperate with others because they wouldn't buy British beef. I saw the Austrian government completely marginalised when Jörg Haider and the Freedom Party did well in the elections and went into government. We've all seen the Polish twins finding themselves marginalised and struggling to enjoy EU solidarity as a result of their unilateralism. And Silvio Berlusconi has been an example of even a big country finding itself outside of the political mainstream and unable to enjoy the sort of leadership that you'd expect for a country with that sort of economic clout and history of European integration. None of these countries found isolation very comfortable, and new governments eventually came in and managed to heal the rift. Tony Blair tried to bring Britain back to the European mainstream. Austria threw out the Freedom Party. Tusk made a mission of reconciliation. And Mario Monti has now transformed the way that others look at Italy, at least while he remains in power. But there are European countries that have actually decided to stay on the outside forever. And there's one in particular that chose to preserve its political autonomy outside of the EU when its voters voted not to join in a referendum. And I think it is salutary to explore their experience. The country I'm talking about is Norway. And the Norwegian government has very helpfully in the last few days published a 911-page survey of its experience of being outside of the European Union over the last few years, which makes absolutely fascinating reading. And that review describes one possible future for Hungary. It's got a brilliant name. It's called Inside and Outside, or maybe it's Outside and Inside. And the basic thrust of this report, which was painstakingly put together by a committee of some of the best political scientists and economists and other researchers in Norway, is that Norway manages to get the worst of both worlds, the worst of being outside and the worst of being inside. Norway's agreements with the European Union affect every single area of domestic policy. The report estimates that EU law has been incorporated into 170 of the 600 Norwegian statutes and approximately 1,000 Norwegian regulations. Norway has incorporated around 3/4 of all EU legislative acts into Norwegian regulation and has implemented them more effectively even than many of the EU member states. But at the same time, Norway has not been involved in any of the decision-making processes which led to these agreements being brought into practice. And Norway has had to make a bigger net contribution to the EU budget than most of the EU member states. And I will quote you from the report. It says, Norway's association with the EU has implications at all levels, from matters affecting daily life, vehicle inspections, the working environment, food quality, to major structural issues, the common labour market and the financial market, as well as the balance of power between the parliament, the government and the courts, politicians and civil servants, the capital and the regions, employers and employees. It's subject to all of these changes over which it has absolutely no control. And one of the most interesting elements of this report is where they talk about the fact that Norway has a right to reserve itself against specific policies, which is not the same as a veto over policy. And that's a very important thing to bear in mind for countries outside of the European Union. If you reserve your right to participate in a particular policy area, you don't stop the policy being implemented. You only stop it being implemented in Norway. And that difference doesn't sound very great, but as the report shows, it's had revolutionary consequences because Norway has not once, never, ever, ever used this right to reserve its exclusion from policy. Because what would happen if it did it is simply that the 490 or 500 million European consumers wouldn't be able to trade with 5 million Norwegians. But Norway would not be able to trade with the European single market. So the balance of power is such that even though it's not in the single market, even though it doesn't get to affect the details of any of the discussions, it's never been felt to be in Norway's interest to opt out of anything. So this report basically concludes that not being in the EU, that life outside is a disaster for democracy. It has not protected the country from decisions made in Brussels and in other member states. Instead, it has made Norway into a semi-sovereign country that has a third of its legislation that was decided outside of its own borders. And I think that's a very interesting note on which to end, because the dilemmas that we have are dilemmas that I think about a change in the nature of sovereignty, where both within the European Union, governments are constrained by decisions and by laws made elsewhere. But life outside of the European Union seems to be equally constrained. So we have a continental-wide distribution of power, but we don't really have either a European politics which can hold it to account and which can create real discussions about what needs to be done, nor have we adjusted our conceptions of domestic politics to work out what it means to be a liberal democracy in a more integrated Europe, which is in itself undergoing a process of profound change in a world where power is flowing away from us towards the rising powers of the East. Many thanks.